Good evening. Welcome to Country Club, United Methodist Church. My name's Keith Morgan. I'm the pastor here, and we're glad to have all of you here with us this evening. If anyone needs, there are restrooms out this door here to my left, both the men's and women's, and a unisex bathroom as well out there. We're glad to have Mark Holland with us tonight. We're thrilled that he accepted our invitation to come and share with us. We're all very interested in what's going on in our denomination, and he has been collecting information and talking to people and supporting different things that are going on, and so we're really thrilled to hear what you would have to say to us, Mark, and I'm not going to take up any more time than that. We are recording tonight, and it will be on our website, countryclubunitedmethodistchurch.org, and it will be under the sermon archives.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's humbling to be put under the sermon archives, yes? All right, well, good evening, everyone. Is that a little loud? Can we pull that down a little bit? Thank you. All right, I have a couple things. One, it's still really loud up here. Is it too loud? No, it's fine. It's just me. Yes. Okay. I'll get used to that. I have a sign-up sheet if you want more information about Mainstream, MainstreamUMC. You can sign up with your name and email. If you change your mind at the end of the evening, you can just come cross your name off, right? Because you never know what you're signing up for first.
If you're already signed up, you don't want to.
If you're already signed up, you don't need to. There you go. Thanks. And everyone gets a souvenir for coming out tonight. How great is that? Nobody mentioned that, did they? So I have some cards. Everyone can have a card. You got to have a handout. Yeah, if you just pass them around or however you want to do it. Thank you.
This isn't a pledge card.
It's not a pledge card, but I am a United Methodist pastor, and I'm willing to pass out pledge cards. I'm not offended by pledge cards, I'll say that. So it's good to be here, and if I could, I'd just like to start by thanking Pastor Keith for the hospitality and Linda for helping to set this up and for the opportunity to come here to Country Club to the other side of the state line, which, as you know, because of the conference line, I'm in Great Plains, that there should be a moat with alligators in it because we just never cross over to the other side, but it's good to be here. If I could, I'd like to start with just a word of prayer. Good and gracious God, we thank you for this opportunity to gather, to talk about your work in your church. And Lord, we ask that you will continue to pour out your Holy Spirit upon us. Our church is broken right now, and we ask for your guidance, your healing, your creative touch, that we might find a way forward that is healing and life-giving for everyone. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So I want to start, I aspire to do a couple things tonight. One is to give just a little bit of introduction. The second is to talk a little bit about the history of how we got to where we are now. The third is to talk about some of the plans that we have in front of us going into General Conference 2020, and then to talk about what hope we have for the future, because I think there is. I'm frequently reminded that in the times of deep chaos, and we are certainly in a chaotic time in the church right now, is when God does God's best work. And so we need the Spirit moving across the waters of difficulty and unknown. And we are ready for God to call out what will be new. And so I think there's reasons for hope based on what's kind of coming together. So a little bit of background. I'm a third-generation United Methodist pastor, notably for this conversation in 3 different denominational structures. My great-grandfather was an ME South pastor in Arkansas, Missouri, and Kansas. My father was a Methodist pastor in Kansas his whole career, and I was born into the United Methodist Church. I served a rural church, 2 rural churches early on for 3 years, and then I was in Kansas City, Kansas at Trinity United Methodist for 19 years. And while I was there, I served in elected office as well on the city council in KCK, and I served as mayor for 4 years. And I learned that I learned everything I needed to know for politics in the church, right? To paraphrase our Lord, where two or more are gathered, there will be politics also. Naturally, not at Country Club United Methodist Church, but at other churches, clearly at other churches. So I have been an alternate or a delegate to General Conference since 2000, and have seen the kind of the ebb and flow of the conversation around homosexuality in real time, and it's been very painful to watch. It's been a very painful 20 years at the General Conferences. I was a delegate at 2016 when it looked like the church was just going to shatter. I mean, there's a difference between having something break and something just shattering. And it felt like our denomination was headed for crashing, and I had the opportunity to make a motion at that General Conference to ask the bishops to lead us forward. That motion passed by 25 votes out of 860, a mandate of the people. And the bishops formed out of that the Commission on the Way Forward and did a 2-year study about how we could live together. They came up with the One Church plan. That church, come on in, that was supported by 2/3 of the bishops, and even more than that, it was an overwhelmingly supported vision for the church. But yet another plan emerged out of that called the traditional plan that was really a completely different direction. The One Church plan was how we could live together with difference. There are some in our church who believe we cannot live with difference and say that it has to be our way, or they're going to leave, or they're going to try to force others out. The traditional plan was really a forced departure of trying to push progressives and centrists out of the church. Now, just to give you an awareness for any hope you have for my predictions, if I was sure the One Church plan had the best chance of passing, the second most likely I thought was that nothing would pass. The least likely scenario, I would have told you a year ago, is that the traditional plan passes. And in fact, that's what did pass, by a narrow margin, by 28 votes. And if we could have flipped 15 delegates to vote a different direction, it could have turned out differently. Well, actually, excuse me, if we could have flipped 28 delegates to vote differently, it would have turned out differently. But we are in a remarkable place in our church because it's not just a U.S. vote. If the voting on ordination and marriage of LGBTQ persons had been voted on in a U.S.-only vote, it would have passed in the U.S. 12 years ago, like it did for the Presbyterians, the Lutherans, the Episcopalians, of course the UCC even before that. But there was a critical mass in the United States about 12 years ago. But one of the remarkable parts about the United Methodist Church is that we're a global church. And the global numbers are remarkable because in 1980, about 5% of the votes at General Conference came from outside the United States. In 2020, next year, it'll be 44% of the votes will come from outside the United States. So what's happened over the last 40 years, it's made that difference. Starting in the 80s and 90s, we changed a practice, not really a policy, but changed a practice that when churches outside the United States grew to a certain size, instead of spinning them off into independent churches, we started absorbing them into the United Methodist Church. And there are really, I think, 3 reasons for that require increasing levels of cynicism. So you can decide if you're feeling cynical today. The first reason I think is legitimate and valid, which is the United Methodist Church in this country is 94% white middle class, right? Present company excluded, yes, but that's about the statistic on the United Methodist Church. The global diversity that we have in Africa and the Philippines, Eastern Europe, is remarkably beneficial to the church. That when we're talking about poverty in the United States, we're talking about this, and we're talking about poverty in Africa, we're talking about this. So there's an enriching conversation of having a diverse church, which I think we all value. The second reason, though, is that starting in the mid-60s, all mainline denominations began to decline in the United States and Western Europe. And the United Methodist Church was no exception. We went from 9 million members in the 60s to 7 million members today. If we had not absorbed churches from other places, we would be a declining church. But by virtue of bringing in 5 million members from Africa, we have continued to be a growing church. Is that cynical? A little? The third reason requires the highest level of cynicism, which is I believe there are a number of people in the denomination who were delighted to have reliably conservative votes continue to come into the General Conference. And so knowing that those outside the United States are much more conservative on a number of social issues, but certainly the issue of homosexuality. There are places in Africa where homosexuality is illegal, in some places punishable by imprisonment and death. And so we have churches in countries where homosexuality is illegal. And so when we start talking about full inclusion of LGBTQ persons in the life of the church, people can't believe it. So yawning cultural gap in terms of the conversation that we need to address. The remarkable part is that as we've moved forward in the conversation, there have been increasing levels of restrictions. So in 1972, language was added into the Book of Discipline for the first time that said homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. Ironically, the exact same year that we removed language prohibiting divorced pastors from remaining in the pulpit. Prior to that, if a pastor were divorced, there was a conference committee on divorce who would get together and decide if it was a biblical divorce. And if it was a biblical divorce, then he, typically at that time, could remain in the pulpit. Otherwise, he would have to leave. That restriction went away in 1972, and we added in restrictions instead about homosexuality. Later on, someone discovered that there were gay pastors in the church. So in the mid-90s, they decided we would add language that said you cannot be a self-avowed practicing homosexual and serve in the United Methodist Church. Later on, they discovered that gay people were getting married. Even though marriage wasn't legal yet, they're having covenant services. And so there was a movement in the 2000s to add language that said no United Methodist pastor may perform a same-gender covenant commitment wedding service, nor can they happen in the buildings or in the buildings of our churches. So those restrictions were added as well. And again, in the United States, there's been a growing acceptance, a growing inclusion, but it has been outpaced by the growth from outside the United States. Actually, if you look at the map, all the Methodist churches in Canada, Mexico, Central America, and South America are all independent Methodists. If you go to Asia, all of India, China, Australia, Korea are all independent Methodists. And in Africa, there are 10 million Methodists in Africa. Only half are United Methodist, because the other half came of age, if you will, before our change in practice of absorbing churches into our denomination. So the United Methodist Church only represents about a third of all Methodists globally. But it's very interesting that we don't have, the United Methodist Church is sort of global. We have churches in the Philippines, we have churches in Africa, and we have churches in Europe. But in Europe, we have about 60,000 members. In the Philippines, about 200,000. Actually, the Philippines is about the same size as the Great Plains Conference. And another kind of quirky piece, the Philippines has 52 votes for 200,000 people, and Great Plains has 14 votes for the same number of delegates. And it's because we have a rule that every annual conference gets 2 delegates. It's sort of like the Congress and the House of Representatives. You get 2 no matter what, and then if you're a large conference, you get more. So Great Plains gets 2 just for showing up, and then we get 12 more because we're a large conference. But the Philippines have split into 26 different annual conferences, which get 2 votes each. So they have 52 votes. Just a little bit of an anomaly. Also, Europe has about 60,000 members, about a third of the Philippines, and they have 40 votes for the same reason, because every country has a different annual conference. So the numbers are remarkable when you look at the changing landscape. Now, after the 2019 vote, there was a tremendous backlash in the United States. People were very angry and frustrated. It felt like for many Americans that the vast majority of U.S. delegates had voted with our bishops and followed the leadership of our bishops, and the vast majority of delegates from outside the United States had followed the leadership of the WCA, the Wesleyan Covenant Association, which many in the United States consider to be a marginal group that doesn't represent the full church. And so there was a lot of anger and frustration, and that played out in annual conferences across the country. And prior to 2019, the progressive centrists claimed about 2/3 of the delegates, and the WCA claimed about 1/3 of the delegates in the United States. Well, there was a backlash against the WCA in the May and June annual conferences, and now you can see by the red and the pink on this map is actually on our website at MainstreamUMC.com. You can see that now 3/4 of the delegates are centrist and progressive, and the WCA share of the U.S. delegates has shrunk to under 1/4. It's now 24%. So there was a major backlash in the United States. In fact, there were enough votes flipped in the elections in May and June in the United States to overturn the outcome of the 2019 General Conference, except that the math continued to slide with the demographics because Africa picked up a number of new delegates and the U.S. continued to lose delegates. So instead of actually making up ground, we just didn't slide as far, but we actually have less helpful math now in 2020 than we did in 2019. This isn't the hopeful part of my talk. This is just an update on kind of where we are. The other thing that I always like to mention is there's mythology out there, and when I spoke with the Central Conference bishops last week in Lake Junaluska, North Carolina, they were meeting ahead of the whole Council of Bishops. Myself and Nanette Roberts, she's the senior pastor at Grace United Methodist Church in Olathe and co-founder of Mainstream. She and I were able to visit with the bishops. And one of the things I shared with them was there's some mythology out there that the conservatives in the U.S. have all the votes, all the people, and all the money. Well, clearly do not have the votes. In fact, decline in overall votes. And the other map we did was to show where the money from the United Methodist Church is coming from. And of the churches that rejected the traditional plan, the annual conferences with a majority votes against the traditional plan, that's 44 out of 54 annual conferences in the U.S. Those 44 annual conferences are contributing 78% of the $160 million annual global budget. There's a $160 million annual global budget. The conferences that reject the traditional plan pay 78% of that. And those that have a majority, the 10 conferences that have a majority of WCA delegates, contributed 17% of the overall budget. So when we're looking at who the United Methodist Church is, the reality is that centrist and progressive United Methodists, meaning those who can live with difference and those who want to see a change in our LGBTQ stance, far outnumber everyone else. Some titles have come up in the last couple of years between compatibilists and incompatibilists, which I think is language somebody made up because I don't think those words are real, because they always are underlined in red anytime I type them. But the incompatibilist would be someone either on the left or the right who would not live in a church with people who think differently than they do. And we use these terms left and right, conservative, liberal, progressive, centrist. None of these titles fit anyone perfectly, but we use them for shorthand for lack of other useful tools. But the majority of people we believe are compatibilist, meaning we can live with folks who are different. And I don't know about your church, but every church I've ever been to and have pastored doesn't have 100% agreement on ordination and marriage of LGBTQ persons. There's no church so conservative, there isn't one holdout that doesn't say, I think we ought to ordain folks. And there isn't any church so liberal that there isn't somebody that says, I just don't believe that. And you know what we do in the local church with people with whom we disagree? We sing in the choir with them. We serve in the food kitchen with them. We worship God together. We celebrate life and death together. We celebrate the resurrection together. I've not heard anyone say, I'm not going to cook a casserole for that guy's funeral because he was too liberal. Not heard it. We serve one another in the local church, and the one church plan, which is gone and not coming back, said basically, we can live together in the same church because we're already doing it. We do it in our local churches, we do it in our annual conferences. Why can't the general church reflect the same thing that we do? And in fact, Thanksgiving dinner is coming up, isn't it? And I don't know what your Thanksgiving table looks like, but I know what my Thanksgiving table looks like, and we don't all agree. And so what we do is love one another and care for one another. I expect our church not only to meet that expectation, but to exceed the generosity of living with difference. But there are folks who have said, we can't do it. I did a survey through Mainstream. I don't know if any of you participated in that. We had 13,000 people participate. We were hoping for 400 or 500 so we could get some good numbers. And we had 13,000 people respond to this survey, which was overwhelming. But one of the questions was, are you willing to live with people who think and practice differently than you on the issue of LGBTQ ordination and marriage? Centrist, people who self-identified as centrist and self-identified as progressive, at the 80th percentile said, yes, we will live with difference. We don't have to have every church do the same thing our church does. In fact, most said, we don't care if you have gay pastors at your church, but let us have gay pastors at our church. We don't mind if you don't do gay weddings, but let us do gay weddings at our church because we're meeting our mission field. And our mission field calls for this. And so we want to meet the needs of our people, because at the end of the day, it's not an issue. At the end of the day, it's people. It's our brothers and sisters in Christ that we're trying to serve. And so at the 80th percentile, centrists and progressives, those who identified that way, said, yes, we would live with difference, even with churches that disagree with us and practice differently. At the same 80th percentile, those who self-identified as traditionalists said, we will not be in a denomination where any church allows for ordination or any church is doing a wedding. We just won't live in that denomination. Well, that becomes irreconcilable, doesn't it? And like any divorce, it takes two people to heal it, but any one person can end the marriage. And so that's where we are in the United Methodist Church. The traditionalists have said, we're not going to live with you. Their attempt to push centrists and progressives out of the church, the traditional plan, they won that vote, but they lost the hearts and minds of the U.S. church. Overwhelmingly lost the hearts and minds of the U.S. church. So the next tack is they want a divorce. They want an amicable separation. Now, last year, those of us working for the One Church plan worked very hard against an amicable separation, in part because they called it a gracious exit, but gracious exit meant you can leave nicely. The gracious exit was don't let the door hit you on your way out. It was not mutual. It was simply an eviction notice for people who would not abide by their interpretation of the scriptures. So the One Church plan fought against an amicable separation. And that's probably the biggest change you're going to see now going into 2020, is all groups are saying, progressive, centrist, traditionalists are saying, there needs to be a way for an amicable separation. We have irreconcilable differences that one group has identified as irreconcilable and said we won't do it. Now, there are some folks on the far left who would say, I'm not going to live in a church that is unjust anywhere, because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, yes. And if there's a church that refuses to do a gay wedding, I don't want to be in a denomination where that's possible. That's a very small group of progressives. Most of the traditionalists are the ones who have self-identified as incompatible and said we're not willing to stay in the denomination. So everyone now is looking for some kind of amicable separation. So there are basically 4 plans on the table right now. The 4 plans are, number 1 is what I'll call the Indianapolis plan. It's formerly the Bard-Jones plan. The Bard-Jones plan was not submitted as legislation. It really morphed into the Indianapolis plan. The Indianapolis plan is championed by the Wesleyan Covenant Association and the conservative groups. They did have a couple of folks who self-identify as centrist and progressive who helped write that. I will note that no centrist or progressive organization was asked to send a representative to that group. It was a group that was selected by the WCA to put that plan together. So just FYI. The Indianapolis plan is a dissolution plan for the denomination. Now that would make them very mad to hear that, because they would say it is not a dissolution plan, absolutely not a dissolution plan, but it creates 3 new denominations: a traditional denomination, a centrist denomination, and a progressive denomination. And they say it's not a dissolution plan because the legal entity of the United Methodist Church would flow into the centrist group. But what they want is they want every church and every annual conference to vote on one of those 3 directions. That every church would have to decide, are you going to go with the traditional church, the centrist church, or the progressive church? Now here's what's crazy. Every church has all 3 of those groups, right? So asking every church, and every annual conference has all 3 of those groups. And so now you're asking every church and every annual conference to pick a winner and a loser and say, who's the biggest group and where are you going to go? The plan would not allow anyone to retain the name United Methodist Church without a qualifier. And so you'd have to be the United Methodist Church this or that. And who wants to put on their sign United Methodist Church centrist/progressive? It's just too long, right? It just doesn't make any sense. So there's if no one gets to use the name, I would describe that as a dissolution. If every group has to pick one way to go, it's because the old is no longer around. Every group would have to write a new book of discipline. The only reason you have to write a new book of discipline is because the old one is no longer valid. That's a dissolution plan. So they can call it no dissolution, no dissolution, no dissolution, and they will and do. I'm just saying, based on all of the centrists and progressives who have read the plan, have said it's a dissolution plan. The other thing it does is it says by default, all central conferences will come into the traditional side of the church. So unless a central conference votes differently, they all automatically default to the traditionalists. There were no central conference delegates who helped write that plan. That was just a courtesy the WCA did for our friends outside of the United States by telling them exactly where they would go if they support this. Now, the general agencies would default to the centrist group, with the exception of Westpath and GCFA. And then they want those to become separate 501c3s, which Westpath sort of already is. And then they want UMCOR, United Methodist Committee on Relief, to be its own 501c3 to serve everyone, because that's almost all we can agree on, right? Pensions, everyone wants to protect pensions, and we should help when disaster strikes, right? I wonder who's going to help our church when disaster strikes. Maybe Lutheran Aid will come help out when the Methodists crash. So that's the Indianapolis plan. That plan is here. What you don't see in the Indianapolis plan is this other piece, which is called how they're going to handle the finances. And this is accompanying legislation that they have intentionally separated from the plan instead of attaching it to the plan. But here's what it's all about, and I know this is going to shock some church members. It might be that this whole fight is about control of money. I hope I'm not hurting anyone's feelings. But it might be that it's about the control of money. There are some crazy numbers that have been thrown out there by the traditionalists that say there's $1 billion worth of general conference assets. There's $500 million worth of general conference assets. Okay, there's $100 million worth of general conference assets. So what they want to do is have an appraiser come in and appraise all of the valuations of all of the general agencies. And they all get to keep their property, but all of their assets they consider liquid, and that those would be divvied up among the 3 different churches based on population. Which is why they're defaulting the central conferences into the traditionalists. Because without that, the WCA is 15% of the global church. With the central conferences, now suddenly they're 55% of the general church, and they would get 55% of the money. It's a pretty shameless money grab that they simply want to divide up the assets of the general agencies. What Reverend Nanette and I were able to share with the Central Conference bishops was our concern about the Indianapolis plan, among others, is that they simply want to burn the bridge between the U.S. church and the Central Conferences. And they want to burn the bridge by doing this, by putting the Central Conferences in a separate denomination, and then taking the General Board of Global Ministries, which is our bridge to the Central Conferences, take its money, have a fire sale, and then leave the shell with the centrists. So we have the General Board that's our bridge to the Central Conferences, but we don't have any Central Conferences to bridge to now. They're all in another denomination. And we don't want to sever the relationships. The General Board of Global Ministries is our bridge for all of our missionary work, for the advanced specials. It's the path through which UMCORS, they actually want to pull UMCOR out of the General Board of Global Ministries. The General Board of Global Ministries is how we are in ministry together with the Central Conferences. And the message we brought from Mainstream was we want to be in mission together. We don't want to be in a separate denomination from the Central Conferences, even though we disagree on this. We still want to be in ministry together. We still want to work together. And the survey also showed that even though about 75% of the U.S. centrists and progressives thought we should have a different general structure, governance structure, still felt strongly that we should continue to fund the global church. There's a strong commitment to that mission together, but the Indianapolis plan severs that relationship completely. That's an unacceptable outcome, I believe. That's one plan, and the financial plan, whenever you see the Indianapolis plan, if someone touts it to you, you should ask them, how do you feel about the financial plan of selling off the assets of the general agencies and divvying those up? Be a valid question, because that's the hidden legislation behind it. Another plan is the UMC Next plan. The UMC Next came out of United Methodist, which was a large advocacy group that we worked closely with last year. UMC Next, maybe the biggest name in UMC Next is Adam Hamilton. Of course, he's the biggest name in the denomination. But UMC Next has put together this national partnership and has come out with legislation that they submitted. And the UMC Next legislation is really based on the Simple Plan. So it has a number of components from the Simple Plan. If you remember last time, the Simple Plan just said, take out all the language about homosexuality, period. And it's not even in the discipline anymore. And so it falls short for progressives of a full affirmation of LGBTQ persons, but it takes out all the harmful language. It removes the restrictions on ordination and marriage, takes out the incompatibility language, which is outrageous, and defaults back to annual conferences decide who to ordain, and local churches decide what services they have. So it goes back to what's already in the discipline. The UMC Next plan does that. It takes the language out. And then it has a couple of other components that are important. One, it has an exit plan. And the statement of the UMC Next is, look, the U.S. church is the U.S. church, and we're not going to let 24% of the delegates dissolve our denomination because you choose not to live with us. That's an outrageous proposition. So we're not going anywhere. But if you want to leave, you can. And so there is a provision in the UMC Next plan that offers an exit. And I'll talk about some of the negotiations that are going on around that exit plan now, because the Indianapolis plan also has an exit plan. And they're similar in some ways with some disconnects. The UMC Next plan also has a 21st century church plan. And this is a very compelling part of this plan, which says, you know what, when we get done fighting about homosexuality, we have a denomination that's in great need. There's a huge paradigm shift happening in the United States and in Western Europe around mainline denominations already. I don't know if you all have noticed that. But the Pew Research just came out again and showed the decline of all mainline churches continues as people choose unaffiliated. That trend continues, and if we're not thinking strategically about how we're going to be a church, we're in trouble. And one of the reasons I would suggest that the United Methodist Church has not been able to address these issues in the last 30 years is because every time we have a conversation, it gets hijacked with whispers of this is pro-gay or this is anti-gay, instead of looking at what the church needs to be. So the 21st century component of UMC Next is very compelling. So simple plan, remove the language, an exit plan for those who would like to leave, no disillusion, and then this forward thinking, and it really sets up a process for the next 2, 4, and 8 years of how we're going to rethink church moving forward. The next plan is by a group called Forward. Forward is from the most progressive side of our church, did not like the term progressive and have adopted the name liberationist, and their plan calls for a dissolution of the denomination. They said that the United Methodist Church is so rife with racism and sexism and homophobia that it just needs to end and we need to start over. And so they call for 4 new denominations: a traditional, a centrist, a progressive, and a liberationist. And so this is their plan that actually is similar in what the WCA wants, right? And these are the 2 groups that would be described as incompatibilist. One is all justice, one is all our interpretation of biblical truth. And so have felt like that the church is in an incompatible place and we need to start over. I don't know that there's a lot of support for the Forward plan outside of that group, though they do have similarities with the WCA plan. The 4th plan that's on the table is the Connectional Table Plan. Now, the Connectional Table is the administrative board of the United Methodist Church. And I think it used to be called the Administrative Board of the United Methodist Church, but we had a clever idea we should call it the Connectional Table. So it's the Uber board of the United Methodist Church. And that has representation from all over the world. And they've been working for a long time on different ways of reorganizing the governance structure. And they have suggested making the U.S. a regional conference. Now, outside the United States, they're called central conferences. And inside the United States, we have jurisdictions. They didn't want to call the U.S. a central conference because of our history with the central jurisdiction. Do you remember when we reunited North and South in 1939? My dad was actually at that reunion. It was here in Kansas City at the Downtown Hotel, and my dad was present in utero because my grandma was pregnant and she went to the meeting. So my dad got to be there. It counts. But we reunited and decided that we would put all the black pastors and black churches in their own jurisdiction in the name of Jesus, right? So we created a segregated church. And because of that history, and it was called the central jurisdiction, was the black jurisdiction. So in lieu of creating another central conference, they thought that language was harmful in the U.S., they're calling it a regional conference, which requires a constitutional amendment because there's no such thing in the Constitution. The great weakness of this is that it says, even in their press release, this does not address the impasse around human sexuality. So why are we amending the Constitution if we're not resolving the impasse around human sexuality? Well, their thinking is, we need to start with the regional conference and work from there, but that's another 4 to 8 years. And I know this about what I've seen progressives say: we're not waiting 4 or 8 more years for anything. We're out of time. Something needs to change now. So the other piece about our discipline that this kind of taps into, our discipline allows for the central conferences outside the U.S. to adapt the book of discipline in a way that is not reciprocated to the U.S. church. Paragraph 101 in our discipline specifies the kinds of things that the churches outside the United States can adapt for cultural reasons. Well, it's a pretty limited adaptation. The Judicial Council of our church, our Supreme Court, has ruled repeatedly that there's a very narrow window of what is actually adaptable What's not adaptable is ordination standards for gay and lesbian people, and what's not adaptable is the definition of marriage, because those have been legislated by the General Conference, and if it's been legislated by the General Conference, it's not adaptable. You can only adapt things that the General Conference has been silent on, and I'll say this for the General Conference: it has not been silent. Yes? So becoming a regional conference, even if we were given the same reciprocal privileges for paragraph 101 to adapt the Book of Discipline, it would not accomplish what we need to accomplish in terms of creating, ending the conversation and providing relief to both sides for what we need. I've actually submitted a petition that would be an amendment to the connectional table plan. I know they're thrilled. I know they're just waiting for me to write an amendment. But I did write an amendment that would actually adapt paragraph 16. And paragraph 16 is the paragraph that actually controls the legislative authority of the General Conference. And what it would do, the way I've written it, and it can be amended. I'm not married to the idea. What I am married to is the idea that we're going to have a regional governance structure that's real and actually allows the adaptation that the U.S. Church needs. But what I wrote in was it would give full legislative power, that's the language in the discipline, legislative power to the General Conference for the first 4 parts of our Book of Discipline, which is our theological task, and everyone agrees on, mostly. And then everything else from the social principles on would be, that legislative power would be given to the central conferences and to the jurisdictions. So it essentially create 5 central conferences within the United States, which is pretty good because we have great cultural differences in the United States, it turns out. I like to say the Methodist Church is the chameleon of the denominations, because in the South, we look and sound a lot like the Southern Baptist Church. In the Northeast, we look and sound a lot like the UCC Church. In the North Central, we look and sound a lot like the Lutherans. In fact, I have a friend, she's a Lutheran pastor in Wisconsin, and she does a 2-year confirmation class. I'm like, what are you doing? 2 years, you're killing me. And she said, well, that's what everyone's used to here culturally. That's what the Lutherans do. I said, well, our kids in Kansas City are so smart, I can do it in 6 weeks. So I don't know what you're doing. But then when you go out to the West, California looks a lot like California. Right? And so the genius of the one church plan was, we're not going to fix Alabama and we're not going to fix California. We're just going to let people be who they are. That's gone. The traditional plan says everyone has to agree with Alabama, right? Or leave. We're not doing that. And the next step is there a way that we can have a regional governance, even by jurisdiction, that looks how it should look? Because the Western jurisdiction is going to be far more liberal than the Southeast jurisdiction, even though every jurisdiction in the United States voted more than 60% of their delegates centrist and progressive. And a fun fact is it takes 60% of the vote to elect a bishop, which means we're never electing another WCA bishop in the United States. So the WCA knows this. They're going to fight a regional plan tooth and nail, because if it were not for the Central Conference delegates propping them up, they would be completely insignificant in this country. And I mentioned that to the bishops, the Central Conference bishops. If not for your votes, you're propping up the WCA, they would be nothing without you. And yet they're writing a plan for you to join them. When the Episcopal Church broke up over homosexuality, the conservative churches left, and they joined churches in Africa. The African churches didn't join the conservative U.S. churches in the Episcopal Church. The conservative churches joined Africa. And I said to the bishops, the WCA should be joining you, and you should be drawing up the next church, not the WCA, if you're going to choose to stay together. So one of the bishops actually commented later about the Episcopal Church and said, yes, that's exactly what happened in the Episcopal Church, because because they have Episcopalians in their countries, and they did have U.S. churches joining the conferences there, the dioceses there in Africa. So those are the 4 plans, basically. What's going to happen? Again, my crystal ball is terrible. There's a growing movement within the U.S., I think, and globally for a regional conference plan, for an idea that the U.S. should have its own autonomy and the other churches should have more autonomy than they have now. It's this whole cyclical piece of centralization and decentralization that's happening, that we've been in a highly centralized state for a long time, and the church is going through a decentralized state, and giving full legislative authority over to churches in Africa and in the Philippines and in Europe to be culturally relevant, but also in the United States, so the United States can vote for our own destiny. There's a growing movement for that, and one of the things I'm encouraged by is the Central Conference bishops unanimously endorsed the connectional table plan, which creates the U.S. as a regional conference. That's big. That's a big step. That's a big help. The Central Conference bishops outside of the United States in Lake Junaluska unanimously endorsed the the connectional table plan to create a regional conference for the United States. That's big. Now, we're going to need accompanying legislation, whether it's my amendment or someone else's, accompanying legislation to actually move through the impasse around human sexuality. Because another thing I heard from the Central Conference bishops is they have all kinds of calamities there. 90% unemployment. They have outbreaks of diseases. They have tremendous strain that they're wanting to do ministry around. And for many, feel like homosexuality is a distraction from what they're trying to do, which is offensive language in the U.S. because we don't consider LGBTQ people a distraction. Again, we believe LGBTQ persons are our brothers and sisters in Christ and are exactly what we need to be a part of. So there's a disconnect there, but there is a connection around a growing sense that the U.S., let the U.S. fight about the U.S. stuff, and then let's come together for mission together. So I think there's a growing movement towards that. That's something that Mainstream, we really want to foster and nourish. There's good parts of the UMC Next plan, which includes this visioning for the future that I think we ought to do. I think the Achilles heel of the UMC Next plan is it expects people from outside the United States to vote to change language around homosexuality in the Book of Discipline. I think that's impossible right now. And so I think that's the Achilles heel for that plan. But the exit plan is good, and the visioning plan is good. So there are negotiations going on. I was asked about this earlier. Bishop Yambasu, from the president of the College of Bishops in Africa, there's going to be a test on this later, so pay attention. Bishop Yambasu actually called together 5 centrists, 5 progressives, and 5 traditionalists to sit down with 3 Central Conference bishops and see if there was a path forward where we could negotiate a settlement, where we could figure out a path. Each of our groups, I was one of the centrists, one of the 5 centrists. Each of our groups chose 2 delegates. So we got it down to 6. And then it's grown. There are more bishops now. There are other U.S. bishops, and there are lay people from Africa and the Philippines who have been included. So there's African bishops, a European bishop, an African bishop, a bishop from the Philippines, 2 U.S. bishops, and this delegation. This group is working right now in negotiated settlement of how we can figure this out. But here are the rub points about what the negotiation is about. Did I already tell you it might be about the control of money? I already mentioned that? Yeah. So one of the issues is, by what percentage does a church vote? Well, first of all, who votes? The first proposal out of the Indianapolis plan, which was nutso, which went away, was that every annual conference had to vote which direction they were going to go, one of the 3. And every member of every local church had to cast a vote, and their local church was their polling station. That's gone. That's where we started. But the idea is, should every local church have to vote no matter what? That's a question. Or what if churches don't want to vote? What if they just want to stay, keep it on, and not have to change a denomination? As it currently stands, if you have to choose one of the 3, It would be much better if you did nothing, if you just stayed in the United Methodist Church. Wouldn't that be remarkable? And only people who didn't want to be United Methodist would have to vote. So that's one negotiating point. Does everybody have to vote, or only the people who want to leave have to vote? The next question is, what percentage vote qualifies as leaving the church? Right now, it's a 2/3 vote to leave our denomination. The traditionalists want that down at 50% plus one. Now, any pastors in the room here? Would you do anything meaningful in your church with a 50% vote? If we were doing a capital campaign and we got a 50% vote, I'd call the whole thing off and say, clearly we don't have consensus, we've got to go back. We're not going to make a major decision about a capital campaign, much less about the future of our church with a 50% vote. The centrists and progressives want a 2/3 vote, 50% vote. Is that negotiable, what the percentage is? That's what's on the table. The other piece is, how much money? How much money is there really? And who gets the money? Do you get the money based on who pays it in? It's a little outrageous that Rob Renfro from Good News, the president of Good News, who's housed at Woodlands United Methodist Church in the Woodlands, Texas, outside of Houston, wants a percentage of the assets of the General Conference. His church, the Woodlands, is a 12,000 member church with a $20 million annual budget that for the last 2 years has paid zero in global apportionments. Zero to World Service, zero to the Black College Fund, zero to Africa University, zero to the General Board of Global Ministries, but yet they want to participate in the fire sale of getting some of the money that others have contributed to the General Board of Global Ministries. This is public information, by the way. The statistical tables, if you Google United Methodist Texas Annual Conference Journal statistical tables 2018, and then know how to read the full thing, all this information is public information. But the very WCA, the areas that are the most WCA populated pay the lowest apportionments, and yet they want a cut of what others have paid into these agencies. So how much money is there really? What qualifies as an asset? Much of the money that's been given has been given for designated purposes by the donor. Donor intent matters. If you get money in your church, and we had this at my church, someone wanted to build a fountain in the foyer, a water fountain. Oh, it was going to be beautiful. Well, there was no endowment to run the thing. I don't know, anyone in Kansas City, Missouri has learned that fountains are expensive to run. Yes? So we'd be glad to have a fountain, but it has to have money to run it in perpetuity. Well, they didn't want to give that money, so we turned the money down. We said, we're not going to build a fountain. They said, well, we're not going to give our money for anything else. We said, okay. But when you have money has been given for a specific purpose at a general agency, it's not as easy to simply untie those bows and say, well, now we can give some of that money to people who are leaving the denomination. It's just not that easy. So the idea that we're going to send to a group all of the assets, it's going to take dozens of years and millions of dollars in legal fees to unpack this. It's a little naive to think that this is going to be unpacked easily and we're just going to hand you 55% of the money. Here's my other question. If they get 55% of the money, do we pay it directly to the WCA or do we pay it to the different annual conferences directly in Africa? That would be more just, would it not? If they're the reason that you're getting money, they should get the money. So how much money is there? How do we divide it up? And how do we pay it out? That's all part of the negotiations that's going on right now. So this is the complexity of it. You have a 200-year-old denomination with 7 million members in the U.S. and 5 million members outside the U.S., and you have a group that's declared itself incompatible from everyone else, and now we need to decide how we're going to divide this up. The best case scenario would be that we go into General Conference 2020 with an agreement that says, here's how much money you get, here's how you can leave easily, and here's how the rest of us continue to be the United Methodist Church. That would be the best case scenario. I would say that's possible. It's possible. What's also possible is that we get to General Conference and we spend 2 weeks and are not able to unfurl this thing. What we do know, and the threat has been, and I've heard it directly from members of the WCA, if we don't pass what we want, the Indianapolis plan, we're going to pass more restrictions through the traditional plan. We're going to re-up in the traditional plan and make it even worse. Here's what we know. The traditional plan is completely unenforceable in the United States. The Western jurisdiction bishops just said, they just released a press release yesterday, they will be safe harbor for gay clergy and clergy performing LGBTQ weddings. And they're not going to advance any of it. Bishop Scholl in New Jersey has said, I am not advancing charges or complaints against LGBTQ clergy. Bishop Carter called for a moratorium. The moratorium that MainstreamUMC put out, we had 8,100 people sign it. And we delivered it to the bishops and said, the people of the United States want to stop these trials. They're outrageous. So it's unenforceable in the United States. They've lost the hearts and minds of the United States. And I think doubling down is only going to decrease their percentages. But there's also a lot of folks who are tired of the harm. A lot of gay people are tired of being the scapegoat in the United Methodist Church for what's wrong with our church. That's outrageous, and it is not true. I've heard the WCA say that the reason that the church is declining is because of the acceptance of gay people. I believe one of the reasons we're declining is the lack of acceptance of gay people. Yes? So what my hope is this. One, that we can break through the old alliances and that the bulk of the U.S. church could reach out in a meaningful way to the central conferences and say, we want to stay in mission together, and we're not going to support a plan that separates us in ministry. I'm very hopeful that that can happen. I'm hopeful that we can find some kind of negotiated settlement where folks will say, okay, this is our deal, we're going to take it and go. No one is going to fight an exit plan. There might be some wrangling over the percentages and the numbers and who has to vote and when, but I think we're ready. There is going to be a group of people who leave the church. My prayer for the church, and it's not because I have some nostalgic view of the United Methodist Church. I already told you I'm third generation in 3 different denominational names. My hope for the church is that we will find a path where the vast majority of the U.S. church wants to stay together, and we can stay in mission together with the vast majority of folks around the world. That's our goal, and we have our work cut out for us to get there. So I'll end there and answer questions if you have some questions.
Yes, I have a microphone for questions, and it's not so much that we can't hear you, but this allows it to be recorded through the video. So if you have a question, I'm going to give you a microphone.
I come at this from a very, some might even say, ultra-liberal perspective, so that frames the direction I'm coming from. However, I am compatible. I do think that language is a little bit helpful because I never desired to tell another pastor in another church and other lay people in other churches how to do their ministry. They have a context, they should be free to do it in that context. But I do think one of the questions I have to you and others who are involved in the General Conference is, when are we going to remove the language that was inserted in 72, which is the root of the problem? Because as long as you have that language, homosexuality is lifestyle incompatible with the teaching of the church, you have a lever that certain groups of people can use to do all the other things that have unfolded since then.
That's right.
That's where I think UMC Next has it right. And do you think that I'm sort of hearing you say that isn't going to fly because Africans would never vote for it? So does that not leave us at the same basic impasse all along the way?
It's a great question, because for progressives and even increasingly centrists, we want that language out of the discipline. It's harmful. It's causing harm. and we don't want our church to cause harm. I'll tell you, in 2016, before we voted to ask the bishops to lead, we actually voted down a petition that would allow the United Methodist Church to support programs to prevent teen suicides among LGBTQ persons. Because teen suicide among LGBTQ persons is 5 times the national rate. And the General Conference voted that down. That's inexcusable. So we have to get the language out. My best hope is that we vote for a regional conference plan that's real, that gives real autonomy, and that we would institute then a moratorium and give ourselves time to say we're not going to recognize this language, we're not going to enforce this language until we can rewrite it. I think if we set all of our hope that in May of 2020 that language is going to be removed, I think we're setting ourselves up for a lot of disappointment. What we can expect is that we have a real path forward, which says the language is still here, but in the United States, we're not going to recognize it. We're going to, and so when we, because even if we vote for a regional conference, then you have to organize it. I mean, you got to have I just heard this phrase, and maybe you've heard it before. Do you know what a camel is? It's a horse that was made by committee. You know, I mean, that's what we do. So it's going to take some time, even if we're a regional conference, to rewrite the Book of Discipline in a way that's acceptable to the United States. But if we have a moratorium, if we come out of General Conference 2020 with a moratorium that says we're not going to enforce it, my hope is that will give people enough hope to hold on for time for us to pass it, because we know for a fact the U.S. Church is done with these restrictions. In every layer, the Southeast jurisdiction, the South Central might be the most conservative right now, but the most conservative jurisdictions in the U.S. have voted more than 60% of the delegates as centrist or progressive. The U.S. is done with these restrictions. The next generation is done with these restrictions. We have to have a path forward. What we can't do is say, well, we're going to leave the restrictions in for 4 more years and try to do better next time. That's not an option. We've spent that coupon. And even asking people to wait from February until next May is too long. That's exactly right. People are already leaving the church because of this restrictive language. We have to get it out. I just think hoping that that's going to happen in 2020 with the makeup of the voters is what's unrealistic. I keep wanting, the New York Times writes these stories about the U.S. church, and I just want to say it's not the U.S. church that believes this. Some do, but the vast 75% of the U.S. delegates are ready to be done with this. And 44 out of 54 annual conferences are done with the traditional plan, are done with this language. So we're ready to move on. But because of our quirky international structure that we've created for ourselves, we have a governance structure that doesn't allow us to do that. And the problem is not the faithfulness of the church. I think the problem is the governance structure. So we need to fix the governance structure probably first, and then the language second. There's a question back here and then up here. Is that sufficiently unsatisfying?
Pastor, do you anticipate any of the General Conference delegates gathering or developing any sort of a procedural conformity? In other words, do you see any attempt among the essentially centrist General Conference delegate majority that was voted in at most annual conferences? Do you see any attempt at going to Minneapolis with any sort of unanimity?
Unanimity I gave up in my ministry a long time ago.
Yeah.
Consensus is our goal. I think that, yes, I do think, and this happened with the One Church plan. I mean, the One Church plan was not from a very progressive side, was not a particularly just plan, right? It was a step forward. And so there was a lot of wrangling that happened before General Conference to encourage people who by gut said, I don't like that plan, but I'll hold my nose and vote for it. So there will be a lot of conversation about what can we agree to that we can hold our nose and support that's going to move us forward, because being stuck where we are is unacceptable. The other piece we really need to work on is our communication to the Central Conference delegates. That's very challenging. I can tell you we have 98% of the emails of the U.S. delegates, jurisdictional delegates and alternates, and maybe, a very low percentage of the global group that some don't have internet access, some don't have email, very difficult to communicate with. That's where we really need to build our consensus as well. But the U.S. church is going to have to get its own consensus, and then we're also going to have to listen to our Central Conference delegates about what they were willing to support and start to get on board with that as well.
I'm not there yet, but I have friends who are seriously there, and I appreciate your cynicism a little bit tonight. But friends say they're not going to give money anymore until the church gets its act together, and therefore by being accepting and welcoming and affirming to everyone. Apparently this is not going to happen next year in Minneapolis, is it?
Minneapolis.
Okay. How long do we have to wait for that?
That's a great question. What's interesting is the WCA has been withholding apportionments for the last 10 years, building their own denomination and their own structures. And now it's kind of flipped, because now progressive churches are starting to think about the same thing. Are we willing to fund a church that's actively harming us? I think we can't wait past May of 2020. Part of our survey was to ask people about the sense of urgency, and May 2020 was the drop dead date for a solution. People aren't going to wait beyond that. I believe a solution could be a changed governance structure and a moratorium that would allow our LGBTQ clergy to be out, end Don't Ask, Don't Tell. That's toxic, and we have a lot of gay clergy who are under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and it would end the prohibition on weddings, in that we wouldn't be enforcing it. The language, I'm just going to say I have zero hope the language is coming out in May. I do have great hope that we have a new governance structure and a moratorium on enforcing the language in May. I think that's realistic. But I think we have to have relief in May, and I think we will have relief in May. Relief isn't the same as what we want.
I'm curious, thinking about removing the language from the discipline regarding homosexuals. Would the Central Conference go along with that, or would they end up with their own discipline?
They would end up with their own discipline that would include the prohibitions.
Okay.
I'm confident of that, and maybe even more strict.
And would they still be United Methodists, and would we still be United Methodists?
In my perfect world, we would still be United Methodists, the Central Conferences would still be United Methodists, we'd still be in relationship together, and we would have separate books of discipline where we can reach out in our way and they can reach out in their way. Now, that's a problem for some progressives who would say, we don't want to fund a church that oppresses gay and lesbian people. And I would just say this: we ended slavery and segregation, and 100 years after we ended slavery was the Voting Rights Act, and now we're dealing with gerrymandering, right? We have not resolved racial justice in the community or in the church yet, but we're still working on it. Just because we ordained women in 1956 doesn't mean every local church has said that they would take a woman pastor. We're still working on that. I don't imagine just because we take the language out of the discipline that everyone's going to suddenly be accepting of a gay pastor. But I do think that we have to take the language out, and it will be very different in Africa. And the question for the church is, are you willing to be in a church with people who think and practice differently than you do around homosexuality? That's going to be the question for all of us.
And how would you, UMCOR, survive all this?
UMCOR is stronger with more people contributing. If UMCOR spins off as one of the proposals and becomes a 501c3 and serves the whole group, left and right, it could continue as it is. I think UMCOR will survive in some form.
Okay.
I think it'll survive in some form.
Okay.
Mark, my question to you is, what is your perception of the Central Conference bishops and this information? Did they receive it well? What were they thinking?
I think so. I think it was, the question was, how did the Central Conference bishops receive it? The presentation that Nanette and I did last week. I do a lot of speaking. I can usually tell when I've lost my audience and it's time to go home, right? Which is coming soon here. Folks were very engaged. We had a 15-minute slot. It actually stretched into an hour of conversation, which was terrific. There was some pushback. There are some committed WCA bishops in that room. There are also some bishops who are frustrated with Americans telling them what to do, and feel like it's been very patronizing and colonial, our whole relationship for so many years, and are wanting some more autonomy. So I think there's different forces in play now than there were even a year ago in terms of how that goes. But I felt like people listened, asked good questions, gave pushback to stuff we had said, which means they were engaged. I didn't walk out of there thinking, they all agree with me. Of course, I never walk out of that room. I never did that on Sunday after I finished preaching. Everybody agrees with me now. But I thought it was well received. And I felt like later that day for them to adopt the connectional table plan is a big deal. Or to not adopt it, but to endorse it. That's a big deal. They did not walk out of that room and endorse the Indianapolis plan. That's a step. So I feel good about it. And it's a conversation we didn't have last year. So it's a step in the right direction. We're also looking for ways, and maybe I'll wrap up with this. We're looking for ways. We're planning on going to the Philippines early next year. We're looking for opportunities to go to Africa and meet with delegates and talk one-to-one about what we might do together, how we can be in mission together. And so that's been really Mainstream's goal. MainstreamUMC started a year and a half ago, formed out of Grace United Methodist Church, so we did not have to form a 501c3. We're only going to work for 1 year. Now we're doing a second year to try to get through this general conference. And we've been raising money to do that. If you would like to contribute to Mainstream, you're welcome to. There's information on the red part of that handout that you can do that, either online or with a check. And we would appreciate your consideration. The other organizations, the advocacy organizations on the far right, are very well funded. They're long-standing. They have some 26 staff members among them, and we're working hard to counter messaging that we think is not helpful. And frankly, we're the only organization that's pushing back on the rhetoric that's coming from the right and helping to shape a narrative that is more healthy. And so any support that you want to give would be terrific. So that's all I have, unless there's any more pressing questions. If you want to sign in. Well, we could talk all day.
But the issue again of bishops and leaders in the central conferences, it does appear to me that there's significant leadership that's not Episcopal in those churches. So those folks don't necessarily follow the leads of their bishops any more than we do.
That's right.
So, but given that, do they have a growing sense of the fact that you cannot aspire to autonomy while being deeply financially dependent on someone? You get the thrust of my question. You talk about it's about money.
In the U.S. side, certainly. It's a very fraught conversation to talk about, because the reality is, and I've published this, 99.6% of the global budget, 99.6% of the $165 million annual budget comes from U.S. churches. So that's the reality. And 78% of it comes from centrist and progressive annual conferences. That's a reality. So there are some financial realities that we need to be aware of when we make decisions, which is different from, and I didn't hear this from you either, but this is why it's fraught, because it's very easy for that conversation to turn to, you're threatening us, or you're colonial, or you're trying to buy our votes. It's a very fraught conversation when you talk about the global nature of our church and how it's funded almost exclusively by the U.S. church, and yet growth is coming from outside of the U.S. church. So it gets messy in a hurry when you start talking about these realities, but they are realities. And the other reality that you spoke to is folks aren't going to continue to fund a church that's harming them or their loved ones. They're just not going to. And I remind people, apartheid didn't end because the Afrikaners changed their mind. Apartheid ended because it was financially unsustainable to continue the system of oppression, right? And so there's got to be a regional governance model, because the U.S., by survey, the U.S. church is still willing to continue to fund the global church. That's not the issue. It's that we can't be harmed by our global structure. And that's where really the separation is. But you can imagine how fraught this conversation gets in a hurry when you start talking about money in the church. It's problematic. So we could talk some more, and I'll be here a little bit afterwards if folks want to continue to talk. But I want to thank you for coming out tonight. I want to thank those who are watching online or watching the video for watching it. I hope this has been a conversation starter in your local church, and that we can continue to have this conversation. The time is coming. And I have great hope for the United Methodist Church, and I hope you do too.
And we want to thank you too, Mark, for coming and sharing.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Go in peace. God be with you, and God strengthen our church as we seek to follow Jesus every day. Amen.